And Aniket speaking second, Yole, please.
Thank you. And in closing opposition?
Unfortunately, my partner checked in and then disappeared, so I will be mavericking. So Connor, he, him, speaking both member and whip.
Okay, that's all good. I would like to remind all speakers just about the POI notification earlier today, just to keep them to 15 seconds. Please remember to, at the beginning of your speech, state your preference of POIs, whether you'd like them through request in chat, for people to hold up a piece of paper on screen, etc. Just so that you can all take them in the easiest way possible for you. Additional to that, I will not be putting time signals in the chat, so you should all time yourselves. However, I will turn on my camera if you get past 7 minutes 15 and hold up my hands to show you that I'm not writing anymore and encourage you to stop promptly. If there are no other questions, can I please call upon the Prime Minister to begin the debate, please? Thanks.
Hi, I just want to confirm that I am still audible.
Yeah, you are.
Okay, thanks. We'll take POIs in the chat. The current system of US politics is largely broken. As we've seen on the news, there isn't much going on that we can be proud of. On OG, we're going to propose a system that we believe will be able to fix the myriad of illnesses that is shutting out voters and poisoning the system of representation in the US. Today, we propose a world in which 4 parties are formed in the US, alongside the current ones, 2 that are made by the moderates of the US Republicans, by the Democrats. In this speech, I'm going to start off with a model, which should be relatively simple and straightforward, then going into 2 parts of this case. First, I'm going to talk about broader impacts on the political system, how we can get things like more representation and less polarization. And secondly, going into more specific impacts on the ability for minority communities and marginalized communities to engage with politics, push for larger change, become more engaged, make politics as a whole more accessible, and the host of other things that comes with that. I'm going to start off with the model though. I guess essentially we're talking in the US, these moderate Democrats are separate from the leftist Democrats. So, that's kind of like Biden and Obama versus Bernie and Andrew, and the right Republicans. So, like Trump versus traditional Republicans. Hopefully there's not too much clarification needed for that. I think it's pretty straightforward. If there's a clarification, please ask it now. Besides that, let's get into the first constructive then on broader ideas on like the broader political system. I'm going to highlight a key problem that exists currently. The idea that parties have to cover too much ground. In a system that relies largely on one party versus another, that is to say the Republicans versus the Democrats, there is a very large need to cater to a very broad ground of voters. So because you need to win a majority, it means that you always need to cater to a fringe on the people on the outside of your party to resist them breaking off or switching sides. That means that you get very distorted representation by a party, because the line that you're towing is not necessarily that is supported by the majority, because you also need to send that message people on the outside. The people who are more likely to stay within your party, you don't need to worry about them very much, because those are voters that you've guaranteed. And regardless of whether or not they actually care about your policy very much, it's unlikely that they're going to be moving anyway. So you kind of don't need to cater to that. At the end of the day, that means that the stuff that you're pushing and stuff that you're doing in your campaign, the policies that you're promoting, those things aren't actually representative of the majority view. This is truer on the right than it is on the left. And this is because the right tends to use a lot more populist rhetoric, and the places where that is concentrated is in areas where you need a lot of key support for the Senate, right? So that means there's a much larger incentive, I suppose, for the right party to kind of engage in this distorted representation in order to keep the fringes of their party intact. I think that leads to a lot of harmful shifts in rhetoric, in the sense that things start to get more intense, things start to get more polarized, and it's harder for the Republicans to kind of rein in that harmful rhetoric. But I also think that Republicans, like the party in general, is very reluctant to criticize them. So, even when Trump started to go off, in terms of, like things like not accepting their election results, it took them a very long time to be able to publicly criticize that and rein that back in to a more truer party stance. Here's how we think that things generally get better in our side, like in a world with 4 parties instead of 2. Firstly, I think these like parties in general are more able to criticize each other when they are separate. This is because there isn't a need to like create like a unified, I suppose, image for a party, and it isn't necessary to kind of be bounded by that hierarchy, in the sense that if someone is very high ranking in your party, it's much harder for you to criticize them, even if their ideology is very different from what the party generally as a whole supports. So that's to say, on our side, you have much better ability to criticize these parties. And that's good not only to inform voters, but also to just form better policy, right? Because when you can have that kind of discourse, it's a lot easier for you to talk about, why certain like the pros and cons, I suppose, of those certain policies. I think it's generally good to be able to criticize each other in politics, to not be sucked into, popular rhetoric and whatnot. But I also think that, like, generally you have better representation, having multiple parties and having them all be able to, to be able to push their ideology to the forefront, whether it's more on the fringe or more moderate. That ability to have a much broader range of discourse is just better representation for people in general, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum. The last thing I want to say is that there's going to be less polarization when you have this amount of parties. It's because in this system, voting and I guess getting voters is a lot less about screwing each other over, because in the 1 versus 1 party system, if I lose voters, that means they're going to you. So there is a need to vilify each other and kind of, make those, I guess, threats, or use, much more extremist rhetoric in order to ensure that doesn't happen. When you have a lot more parties, that means that there is a less targeted vilification of each other, and that makes like politics in general less polarized, and it's a lot easier to like access a system that isn't like constantly using ad hominem attacks. But also, I think these 2 moderate parties will end up being a lot closer in ideology, which just by virtue of them being more moderate, even though they're like going to be a Republican and Democrat party. So that, like, the virtue of them being closer in ideology is probably they just like fight less on ideological grounds and more on on actual policy, which we think is just better for discourse in general, but also makes politics a lot less of a you versus me kind of fight. I'm lastly going to go into some ideas about why this political system will be a lot better for minorities and marginalized communities, while it will be a lot easier to push for genuine leftist policy. Because recognize that current Democrats are basically a losing battle for us anyways, because it's unlikely we'll be able to get any actual change out of the moderate Democrats. This is because, like I outlined earlier, their priority is generally to get elected, right? So that means they have to draw on their own fringe and also work on, getting the attention of moderate Republican voters that might swing over to support them instead. That means that they have to make a lot of concessions. They have to let go of a lot of more polarizing, or I guess a lot more stuff that is viewed to be a lot more extremist in terms of leftist policy. So that's to say, so I think we'll get good change out of the Democrats. Why is it good then for this leftist party to exist, even if it's not elected because it doesn't cater to a much larger ground of people, or because it hasn't existed for as long of a time? Generally, I think that its existence is going to be useful because by virtue of it campaigning and existing in the public view, that is more representation, and that kind of makes politics more accessible as a whole. When you see people that actually support the policy that you are supporting on things like social media, when you see people that actually look like you that are unlikely to be able to do very well in the more moderate Democratic Party that also has to cater to moderate Republicans, that's just generally good for you to be able to access politics as a whole. But I think this party is also going to be more willing to work with social movements, right? They're more likely to be able to use their platform to actually, engage with people on the ground, because that's kind of, where a new political party starts from. This party is probably also going to be dominated by a much younger generation of politicians. As a whole, I think this leftist party is a lot more accessible to people, and it's a lot easier for you to push for leftist policy in that sense. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the first speaker of the opposition side, please.
Am I audible?
You are, yep.
I'd like POIs to be raised verbally. So, may I begin?
You may.
All of their claims of better policies and better politics were just assertions and weren't mechanized. We're going to prove to you how already the preference of voters already reflected within the current US party system. So if you're fiscally conservative and socially liberal, you vote based on which value you prioritize more. And a number game of 2 parties to 3 parties wouldn't significantly change anything, but we're going to prove to you how this will even worsen polarization and leach the supporter base from the Democratic Party, which means that this will rather strengthen the Trumpian Republican Party that we see now, and many people problematize now, because as we've seen in this presidential election, their voting bloc is pretty much solidified. And as we know, common essentially, they're not moderates. They're very clear that they're against most liberal and progressive agenda. So we say that under their case, they never successfully proved why suddenly 2 parties into 3 parties will mean that vilification within the election process would not exist, because now it means that you're going to vilify the 2 other parties. We think that there is an attribution problem in their entire case, because in the US political system, coalition building between parties is not existent. This is only possible under a UK or an Ireland system, which has a different political culture and a different political party system from the start. So we think that only adding 1 more party just adds more trouble. So I'm going to present you 2 substantive material. Firstly, I'm going to prove to you what's absolutely unnecessary to create a separate party and how it's going to be grossly ineffective. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the active harms that this will cause. Firstly, talking about how this will stymie the creation of future-oriented policy, mostly progressive ones. Secondly, talk about how this will exacerbate polarization. And thirdly, talk about how this will significantly weaken the current Democratic Party and strengthen the Trumpian Party. So let's firstly move on to why this is so ineffective. Currently, there are already measures to moderate policies, and we think that moderate politicians and moderate policies are already mainstream. Like, look at Joe Biden, he's a moderate. So we see that in the current US politics, there is a process of compromise through Senate and House approval. And when we look at Obamacare, when you look at relief packages during COVID, there is a process of striking a balance between different political leanings of both parties. And secondly, this type of check and balance happens because there are already factions and wings within parties. So within both the Republican and the Democratic Party, especially the Democratic Party, there's the youth wing, the progressive wing. And as we look at Joe Biden's administration, we look at him increasingly trying to include the voice from different factions like the youth and the progressive wing as we look at his cabinet nominations. So, and also by this I've proven to you how this is this creation of a new party is unnecessary. And I'll secondly prove to you why this would be ineffective, because the moderates in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party fundamentally lack ideological similarities. We think that this new party means that there wouldn't be enough representative value. Why is this so? We think that this will going to be a very incohesive bloc, failing to attract voters, because we see that currently US voters, based on very important issues that they identify with the most, which are litmus tests. So for example, a lot of people vote based on taxation policies, based on abortion, based on religious issues or whatnot. And we say that currently there's a very strict line between what actually makes you vote for the Republican Party and what actually makes you vote for a Democrat Party. And we think that this type of moderate bloc wouldn't be able to garner a lot of voters, because we think that this would be the middle line, which does not really attract a significant ideological pool. So having this said, let's move on to the active harms. So firstly, we think that this creation of a new third party distracts the public, especially the Democratic Party, from pursuing a more ambitious policy agenda. What do we mean by this? This is extremely crucial because such policy agendas like the Green New Deal or universal healthcare are very, very critical to A, for the future generation, and B, to secure the rights of the most vulnerable populations within the US society. So we think that these types of political breakthroughs, which are often led by the progressive party, which is the Democratic Party, often benefit the public, and they seem really extremely radical at first. So we see in the case of the implementation of the health insurance in European countries or Scandinavian countries, when a lot of people saw this as a socialist and a communist scheme. So we see that under our world, if those policies are pushed by the more radical wing within the Democratic Party, we think that a more moderate president is likely to listen to those voices and try to come up with a compromise bill that do reflect those new voices, that do reflect those new demands, and slowly, gradually bring up this new change. But under this new world of 3 parties, why would this not happen? We think that this election tactic of this moderate party, since they want to gain more voters and gain win the election, they would try to aggressively brand the Democratic Party and the status quo as extremist, communist, and socialist. And we think that this is what actually the Republicans are doing now. But I think this new moderate party, since their tagline is being moderate, will also try to capitalize on this and brand the entire Democratic Party as extremist. extremists. So we think that this will actually stymie the efforts of this new progressive wing to create more policies and seep into like the political stage we see now, which have actually brought a lot of progress within US politics as we look at like the contributions of AOC and Ilhan Omar. And secondly, this will exacerbate polarization because since this new third party, which is trying to present themselves as moderate, will try to explain how the Democratic Party is too extremist and like too left wing, and how like the current Republican Party is like a party for Trump. So we think that this will actually like create more cleavages, more hate tactics within the US political system, because just that you create a new party does not mean that this type of hateful tactic will go away magically. And we think that they never sufficiently proved why like all of like a new party will translate into all of the benefits that you have mentioned. And also thirdly, we're going to explain to you how this will leach the voter base from the Democratic Party. So we think that more Democrats in the status quo are moderate than Republicans. This is because like during the 4-year administration of Trump, we think that like the entire Republican Party has been like going towards the right wing. It's there has been a consolidation like with Trump in the center, and many people believe in very conservative values like blocking immigration and kicking like people out because they don't represent the American like white value. So we think that this type of new branding of the Republican Party means that if this new moderate party is created, they're going to take the moderates from the Democratic, and it's more likely that a lot of Democratic like candidates or Democratic politicians will move on to this new moderate party. And this means that as we see now, like since the Trumpian Republican Party is like very strong, as we've seen in this past election, we say that this will actually like embolden the Republican Party even more, because this splits the voter base, which would have voted for the current Democratic Party. This means that the moderate Democrats and the more progressive Democrats will now vote for different parties, which means that it's likely to see an America with the new more radicalized Republican Party getting like elected and also like serving for another 4 years, like just crushing all the fundamental like constitutional values. So that's not a future that we want to see. So extremely happy to apply.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the second speaker at the opening government side, please.
Hi, sorry for the delay. Can everyone hear me?
Is it possible for you to move slightly closer to a microphone or something? You're currently a little soft.
Sure, sorry, I'm just speaking a little quietly because it is very early in the morning and I do not want to wake my family.
I'm really sorry. Yeah, that makes sense.
I'll take POIs in the chat. If I'll probably take a POI around 5 minutes or 5:30. So if you want to save your POI till then. Is this better? Can you hear me very clearly?
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I have two themes for you today in this speech. Firstly, I want to talk about general improvements to the political system and why we're likely to get impacts like more cooperation, less partisan deadlock in government, more discourse, etc., and more representation. After that, I want to talk about how we're likely to get more progressive policy, more push for leftist policy, and less alt-right fascism in popular or mainstream politics. I'm going to be integrating refutation into these. Before that, I just want to clear up a characterization. This isn't the moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats forming a single party, rather they form separate parties, so this would be a system with 4 total parties. That being said, I want to talk about general improvements to the political system. In the status quo, Serena tells you about how in the status quo, often these 2 parties cater to fringe voters to preserve the idea of political unity, to prevent fracturing, right? And what are the responses to this? Because we get an alternate characterization out of opening opposition. They say that there's a big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, and that nobody's going to support these centrist parties. But there's a really important thing that Serena tells you is that this is actually false. This is an illusion. That the centrist Republicans and centrist Dems, the center of those two parties, aren't actually that different. It's just an illusion because through the means of politics, they're often forced to cater and brand themselves and move towards the fringe. But if they were to separate from those fringes, that they'd actually become pretty similar. So this idea of like, oh, there's a huge difference between these two parties is actually only one that exists in opposition's world and something that disappears on prop world, right? But I want to talk about something else. Actually, I'll get to it later, right? So what does this look like in the status quo? What does catering to fringe on either side or catering to the far right or the far left look like in the status quo? It means in the Democratic nominations, you have to move away from the center and towards the left in order to win the Democratic nominations. It means the perversion of the Republican Party, and it means that even moderate Republicans can't call out Trump's BS, or look how long it took them to just accept the results of the election, something that would have happened immediately in any other era of American politics, but took incredibly long for the Republican Party as a whole to even accept, right? This is what catering to the fringe looks like in the status quo. How does this change? Serena tells you a couple things here. Firstly, it means that center-right and center-left parties are now not only have the ability, but have the incentive to criticize their fringes. It means that you get more nuanced discussion and you're able to explore the nuances of both sides. It means you're able to get more discourse between those parties. And instead of lumping every single Democrat as some socialist pig, you're actually able to make a differentiation between different Democrat policies. This is really important because not only does this, and as we'll talk about later, lead to better impacts, but also in general improves the political atmosphere. It means that the kind of discourse that people are engaged in is less about rhetoric that's meant to inflame, anger towards the other side and vilify them, but rather is likely to be more centered around more nuanced political discussion because you now have more parties to participate in that. It means you have less polarization. So that means on government side, you're less likely to see the huge refusal in the status quo to cooperate. It means that parties with similar agendas, so like the center left and the center right, are actually going to work together in Senate and House to get shit done. You reintroduce the idea of bipartisan issues, something that has disappeared from current US politics. What are the impacts of this? One, it means that you have more productive and better political discourse, something that is probably going to help educate voters as a whole, given that most of this discourse is where voters actually get their information from, the kind of stuff that appears on mainstream media, right? It also means you're likely to get more policies passed because when you have parties that have more similar agendas and they're not just able, and the best strategy isn't just to alienate and vilify the other side anymore. It means that those parties are likely to cooperate to get the important things on their agenda done, negotiate between themselves, and actually pass policy. And we're able to escape from the partisan deadlock that exists in the status quo that existed in 2008 and 2012 when Obama got elected, right? But I also want to talk about here, I want to deal with the opposition argument now in terms of like how the idea is like, oh, these fringe parties, or that the moderate parties are going to brand fringe parties as communists, right? I just want to say, like, this kind of rhetoric, the people who are likely to believe this rhetoric, etc., so on the Republican side, probably don't vote Democrat already. So if they believe that these Democrats are like socialist pigs or they're completely communist, they probably aren't voting Democrat regardless. And I also want to say this is not how this realistically plays out in most countries with multi-party democracies. Why? Because moderate Dems need the support of the far left Dems to accomplish some of the same agenda ideas. So when they want to push something that's a little bit more leftist, they actually need the cooperation of the far left Dems, so they can't alienate them all the time. So that's why you're likely to not see the kind of massive amounts of propaganda that OO wants to talk about. But two, no thank you, why you're likely to get more progressive policy and less alt-right fascism, right? Serena explains to you how fringe catering actually occurs more for the Republican side. And the reason why is because there's a concentration of the alt-right in various Rust Belt states. So that means that several small states, even though it's not a huge population, it means that they have a lot of influence over the Senate. They get like 12 senators because fuck America, right? And that means that they're actually really important both in the primaries, but also in the general election. So catering to those alt-right smaller states that have control over a lot of the Senate is really important for the Republicans. But for the Democrats, once they're out of the primary, it means that they're back to catering to the center, right? Because they want to win over swing states. and moderate Republicans. It means that they're controlled by capitalist structures and large lobbyist groups, which forces them to go to the center. So inherently, when you separate this idea of fringe catering disproportionately benefits the alt-right and disproportionately disfavors the far left. What are the impacts we get from this? One, it means that we're better able to criticize the alt-right on our side of the house. It means that now parties have separate, they're separate parties. They're able to engage in things like political commentary. It means that they're able to separate financial backers. And they're able to split voters away from the alt-right. Why would the moderate Republicans do this? Because they're actually closer to the moderate Democrats than they are to the alt-right. They're not complete fascists like Donald Trump is. But secondly, you're able to get more leftist advocacy. Serena already explains, even if the far left doesn't actually get elected into power, they can still have small wins. They can work with social movements. They can grow as a movement and cultivate a huge base of young progressive voters. But it also means because there's a separate party, they can still negotiate for legislation. That means negotiating with the moderate Dems. Oh, we'll help you pass this bill in Senate if you help us pass the Green New Deal in the future. And then that works because far left probably has a lot of control within the House because California has so many voters. Because of all those reasons, we're likely to, one, just see a better political system, but also a move away from fascism and a move towards more progressive policy we're incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Before we move on to the next speech, I'd like to remind all speakers to please time the speeches. POIs should not be given after 6 minutes. Generally for disruption reasons of the person speaking as well. So I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Can now please move on to the second speaker of the opening opposition team, please.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll also prefer POIs in the chat. And okay, one moment.
Have you disconnected? We currently cannot hear you. Can anyone?
I'll try to contact her. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just, yeah.
Sorry, I feel like this has happened once in the rounds before.
Oh, okay. Okay. At least you're still here.
Yeah,
we can hear you now.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's something to do with my headphones, which I have taken off, so I will be able to hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. Whenever you're ready, if you want to count us in.
Yeah, okay. On opposition, we think that generally speaking, the parties will be powerless, or even if they aren't powerless, all that they will do is harm Democrats and liberal policies that I think we generally believe in this debate room. It is simply an idealistic vision and a dream that will not occur and will not be beneficial towards policies that we think is better. I'll talk about two main things in this speech. Firstly, on what will happen to party power dynamics and which party will become stronger. And secondly, on polarization versus the representation of opinions. All explicit direct engagement will be flagged out in the second clash. But firstly, what will happen to party power dynamics? I want to talk about two things things under this clash. Firstly, on why this furthers radicalization, and secondly, on how the centrist parties will split votes from the Democrats instead of the Republicans. Firstly, on radicalization, the main reason why radicalization will occur is just because of the fact that like these centrist parties are unlikely going to be able to have any power at all, because both of the two parties, the two main parties, Democrats and the Republicans, are going to have more support in general because one, they have been here for 2 centuries, and two, they have the name attached to it, the Democrats and versus the Republicans, the donkey versus the elephant. I think in general, if you know anything about human nature, it is that tradition and habits are hard to change, which means that it is more difficult for you to have some kind of new thing rolling, which is the entire reason why inside the United States it's harder for independent parties to gain any kind of traction because people are entrenched within this vision of the two-party system. 3 is that people also have like family histories of supporting particular parties. They have neighbors that pressure them. It is in general hard to break away from existing habits and traditions, and this is why it's hard and why these two parties will still gain all the support and respect that they currently do have. The second reason is just like the new parties are unlikely to have any kind of financial as well as just in general support. That means that even if they campaign and exist, which is the mechanism that we got from OG, which is not really a mechanism, this means that they won't get any policy passed or be voted in at all to get any kind of power. This is because of 2 reasons. Firstly, it's because most money comes from like super PACs or so you can run ads for it in a candidate, individual contributions from people who are rich, also such as like $5 contributions for every small voter. If you look at the different actors in this, the people who are rich are likely going to still give back money to the main parties because the main parties are still the parties who, whenever this independent party comes into power, have more power, right? The Democrats and Republicans are the people who are in Congress right now, who are in the White House right now. So they want to be able to have relationships with politicians that are more likely like to have power, which seen as tradition does not shift to new independent parties. In fact, America has like a 200-year tradition of not giving any independence power. We think this is why rich people and wealthy people will still be giving to people who are currently in Congress, which is the Democrats and the Republicans. It's easier to go with something that you know rather than something new that is untested. Secondly, middle-class liberals in general who give like $5 to the Democratic Party also do not trust because it is far too new. Although all this means is that they do not get any congressional seats or get nominated for cabinet positions because money is important, right? Money is important so you can run ads, so you can go on tours, so you can go do speeches in different places and travel and go across the country and campaign. So all this different things mean is that it's harder for this independent party to get power just because of the fact that it is a new party that does not have much support, no mechanization that we have seen so far. And second reason is just that it's even worse because they're not even advocating for a single party, but they're advocating for 2 smaller ones, which means they're only splitting the money and splitting the votes. Why does this lead to radicalization? This means that the moderates are not going to be there to moderate the 2 parties, right? This means that the 2 parties who currently exist will be devoid of any moderates at all who have gone to this independent party, if you want to assume the model exists. This means that they're more likely going to go to extremes. They will go to extremes because of the fact that all of these 2 parties, the dominant Democrats and Republicans, are now full of people who are unlikely going to be moderate in the sense that OG wants them to be. This means that it is far more likely for all these 2 parties to go even further. Biden is a moderate. That means that Biden is moderating socialism. You moderate other policies. Certain moderate Republicans, as scarce as they are in the Republican Party, also ensure that the Republican Party, as it currently exists, does not become completely white supremacist, etc. The ultimate impact of this is that it is important that polarization does not exist because it makes it harder to compromise. In general, this means that the lack of moderates in the dominant parties that are more powerful are more likely going to get more voters in general, just because of the fact that being more extreme sometimes gets you more voters, mean that you're unlikely to have any moderation in general. Second thing under this is the centrist party will just split votes from the Democrats, because generally speaking, more moderates are more moderate than Republicans, because few people are socialists, and the Democrat Party is not running on socialism yet. Clearly. That's why there was the suppression of Bernie in the primaries. AOC is an outlier. That's why Biden even won the nomination, because he is a moderate. It's also because the Democrats are still catering to the more educated older people, despite a younger population going Democrat. We think that also, like, secondly, the more Republicans are also increasingly Trumpian. It's only an insertion from OG to look at how Republicans are not Trumpian, because this is a shift that you clearly see in the news. Because one, the base that Republicans are catering to in general is become polarized. They're catering increasingly to people who are older, who are white, who are not college educated, who are angry about the system in general. Secondly, if you study the political power of different Republicans in the status quo, you see that skeptics of Trump have also been like falling in their ranks. That's why skeptics like the representative Justin Amash from Michigan left the party. Matt Gaetz of Florida was also the person who supported Trump and rose in the party. All this goes to show that people who are supporting Trump, who are supporting the more radical policies, are increasing in power. Trump has activated a base that few other politicians have been able to go to demonstrate demonstrate that if anything, there are fewer leftist policies because the Democrats are weakened, because more moderate Democrats exist that are going to form the party than there is a strong moderate Republican party. Second thing, on polarization versus the representation of opinions. OG says that they cover too much ground, so therefore it means that it's hard for you to cater to everyone. But the problem is this is literally what anti-polarization means, catering to a large ground of people, because polarization is caused by being too specific and catering to each and every political view. That is why populism is only likely going to increase if now the Republican Party only really needs to use like populist rhetoric or white supremacist rhetoric of the far right, because of the fact that they no longer need to cater to moderates, because all the moderate Republicans, as few as they are, have left the party. Wilson is unlikely going to get better representation of opinions, because it's not the more parties exist, the more representation you get, but whether or not you can actually get policies passed that represent your opinions. But they're also already represented anyways, right? Like in the Democratic caucus, about US politics in general, how there are debates about policies, despite the fact, and if debates about politics are getting more extreme, it's only because the people are getting more extreme. Therefore, you're still accurately representing everyone's opinions. In policy, these moderates are also unlikely going to get policy passed because of the fact that like these parties are unlikely going to get much financial support in the first place. So this means that you're unlikely to get any policy passed that helps them. OG also says that discourse is going to have happen because they're more similar ideology, which I think is just like one, blatantly false, because moderate Republicans don't really exist. But two, you're also trading off discourse from either of the other two parties who are going to be more polarized and more extreme, because all of the moderates have left from their dominant parties. And this is probably worse, because this means that the main parties that have more support and more people are only simply going to get more polarized, because it doesn't matter if like 10,000 people get a more moderate party, but if the other 300 million people inside the United States are going more polarized. In general, this means that policy is simply going to get worse. It will be more extreme. That makes it so that it is less likely you're going to get any compromise in a healthy political system. We're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the first speaker of the closing government side, please.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, awesome. My speech will, I prefer POIs in the chat, please. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Opening government is contingent on two assumptions. First, why moderate Republicans cannot gain control of the current Republican Party, and second, why these moderate Republicans are likely to win compared to the extreme Republicans when they break away and form a new party. In closing governments, we're going to give you 4 mechanisms for each of these assumptions, which we think all of opening government's mechanisms and impacts actually depend on. Rebuttals are going to be integrated within my speech. So first, why do we think that moderate Republicans are structurally unlikely to gain power within the Republican Party right now? 4 reasons why. First, we think that the primary system in the United States rewards turning out a motivated group of core supporters. We think this is unique to the US, and this is exactly how Trump was able to win despite not having the majority vote. This means that this small but vocal minority is likely to continue turning up for the primary system, getting quite extreme candidates, which means that we think the Republican Party is likely to continue staying quite extreme. Secondly, Trump has been able to monopolize power in the party. So initially, we think people voted for Trump because he was quite anti-establishment and populist, so people liked him. But now they have become full converts. So this was seen by how many votes Trump got in the recent election, even despite 4 years in power and people knowing exactly what he has done and what he's capable of. Thirdly, we think that the Republican establishment has already identified with Trump now. So we give you examples of how elder statesmen of the party, for example, people such as Lindsey Graham, have already fully bought into his policy and have vocally voiced their support for Trump. So therefore, we think that lots of the establishment are Trumpist. And fourthly, we think that extreme right-wing media has for years already demonized the other side and have deified Trump. So we're talking about news outlets such as Fox News, such as Breitbart, and we think this is really important because the media is essentially what the core votes of Republicans listen to. It's their main source of information and has vast sway over how Republicans vote. So we think these 4 reasons mean that Republicans, moderate Republicans, are structurally unlikely to gain power within the Republican Party right now. What are the impacts of this? 3 impacts. First, we think the Republican Party on op is likely to continue to be Trumpist, and therefore we think that this is going to be really bad for all the reasons that have already been talked about in the opening half, right? Because Trump is a demagogue, a populist, he's likely to continue pushing for policies that actively harm minorities and continue using minorities as scapegoats. So therefore, we think that if opposition stands for the status quo, this is what's likely to happen. But secondly, we think that these mechanisms prove OG's benefits of progressivism because their benefits are contingent on them actually proving that moderate Republicans won't win so that Democrats can cater towards these original voters for the Republicans. We think we're able to actually mechanize how you get these Democratic votes and actually get progressive policies. Thirdly, we think that the Republican Party becomes unrepresentative of the average voter insofar as the big candidates are likely to become more extreme. We don't think this is what the average American voter is likely to support. So for example, a lot of Trump votes were out of fear of Clinton or because the media had demonized Clinton, and also because lots of people voted for down ballot Republicans whilst voting for Biden primarily. This proves how there's likely to be demand for the new party. Second argument, why are moderate Republicans likely to get into power compared to extreme Republicans when they form their own party? Before I move on,
Why does a creation of a new party magically mean that there be a moderate news channel or media will be backing them? Because now conservative outlets are powerful because they have their own selfish economic interests at stake.
Well, we think that when a new party comes into power, there are lots of different reasons for this. First, we think they're likely to get funding, which I'm going to explain later. But moreover, we think that if the news outlets can see that there is some degree of support for this new moderate party, they're likely to either change their views or there are likely to be new news media outlets that cater to this specific demographic of people. Moving on, why are moderate Republicans more likely to get into power on our side? 4 reasons. First, we think you no longer have the label of Republican versus Democrats, which we think is a really important mechanism. We think this is one of the main reasons why polarization is currently such a massive problem across the US, because basically because people have grown up their whole lives thinking that the other party is evil or being told that the other party has done lots of terrible things. We think what happens when you no longer have these labels, when they're, for example, just named something like the moderate left party or something, they're more likely to switch to a party that best represents their beliefs. So what this means is we get more voters actually thinking about policies and also switching parties. But secondly, we think that you no longer you get more funding from moderate corporate interest. We think currently there are lots of neutral corporations that don't really fund either party because there are scandals and because large parties necessarily encompass quite a lot of views, some of which are problematic. If moderate parties were to break away, they can steer clear of these problems or some specific policies that the big parties would support. Also, we think there are people who are moderates who are likely to be within the corporate world and personally know these donors. We give you the example of the Lincoln Project. So we think, therefore, there's likely to be lots of funding for these moderate parties, which, as opening has proved, is an important mechanism for how these parties are likely to gain power because of campaigning, etc. Third, we think these moderate parties can campaign specifically on local issues that appeal to a broad base. So even in opposition's best case, right, when these people never run for president, they can still get some local legislature. This explains how they're likely to get into power, and we think these positions are quite powerful, even in local legislature, because within your state, we think you still have quite a large degree of power doing policies that actually influence people's lives on the ground. Fourth mechanism is we think moderate Republicans obviously can geographically target certain states. We think this party might not stand in all districts. There are some, for example, quite concretely red or blue states, but they can identify ones they're likely to win in and stand there. So example is a Republican suburb that really dislikes Trump. So 3 reasons why moderate Republicans gaining power is likely to be good. First, we think there's likely to be less partisanship because these moderate Republicans are likely to be willing to work with the other bench, so the government doesn't ground to a halt. Secondly, we think you're also able to crowd out more extreme groups. When you vote for these moderates, now the main Republican Party either has an incentive to also become more moderate or they're going to be crowded out. Thirdly, we think there's a really important signaling effect here, which Democrats now know that which Republicans they can win over and exactly which states are probably battlegrounds that they can engage in. Because of all these reasons, we think we get a much better political system on our side. Vote closing government.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the first speaker of the closing opposition side, please.
I'm just going to turn on my camera. Okay. Let me get my papers here. Oh, geez. Right. Okay. Time begins in, let's see, 3, 2, 1. I think that it is wild to me that we haven't discussed anything than electoralism or federal politics. To the point at which opening government is explicitly pointing to examples from other countries, I think opening government falls out of this round. Look, this round takes place specifically in the United States, in a system, a federal system with an executive presidency, a Senate, and a House of Representatives, and local legislatures with mirrored structures. I think the fact that no team in this round, except for briefly at the end of closing government, has mentioned the fact that there is a two-tiered federal system, that there is a rural skew in the Senate, and that there are systems in place in these kinds of like geographic skews that particularly harm any kinds of outcomes that they want, to the point at which the entire opening half is just trying to prove which side polarizes more, without actually pointing out why this polarization is bad or why this polarization necessarily leads to the kinds of outcomes and terrible things that they're talking about. In closing opposition, I'll first respond explicitly to closing government, but explain why specifically in the United States, why the United States is separate from other countries, and why this moderate system will fail, and the people who get hurt the most are the minorities that opening government wants to protect so dearly. Right. Closing government. So first off, I think that all of their structural reasons as to why that they can prove that moderate Republicans that moderate Republicans can win, all of this argument and mechanization fails upon the point at which a new party that was be created that is center-right would likely in the current system just become Democrats, right? I think that what we saw is that exactly in their example of split ticket voting, right, is that a lot of them didn't like Donald Trump. They rejected the Trumpism of the executive branch and they voted for Joe Biden, but they voted for Republicans down ballot. What this means is that if you create this new party, right, it's unlikely that these individuals are going to then splinter themselves because they're already showing this party affinity. What you end up having, though, is that you end up having a whole new set of ideas and you end up having a splintered Democratic Party. You can't just point out at how the Republicans will fracture without also pointing out that the Democrats will fracture as well. And I think that we've kind of normatively agreed that this is a bad thing. Furthermore, they then talk about why moderate Republicans will get into power. First, I think that this is false, that they can just say that there's no longer this Republican versus Democratic name recognition. I'll go further than opening opposition with this response. It's not so much that they can't break away from this name recognition, but more specifically, because this name recognition is so strong in the United States, because there is hundreds of years behind the party of Lincoln, the party of FDR, both parties that emerge from the left and from the right will both claim the same heritage to take advantage of this. Both the progressives and the conservative Democrats and both the Trumpist and conservative Republicans will both claim to be the party of the Republicans, the true inheritors. And what this means is that instead of having no labels, you actually have increasingly fraught battles over which side is actually the true inheritor of legacy. This is a direct response to opening government as to why their polarization points fall flat. And I think that tribalism emerges no matter what. If I call myself the Liberal Party, I'll have tribalism that emerges after that. Lastly, what closing government ultimately falls upon is that they openly knife their opening government, right? When closing government points out that moderate conservatives will actually be the ones who benefit the most from the system, it means that if we buy this case, we can't take any of opening government's arguments in which they point out that progressives will start winning and getting big policies passed. If the ultimate outcome that closing government wants to go for is that conservatives will win and they will target geographically and they will be able to co-opt moderate Democrats, then all the impacts from opening governments like good on minorities and leftists and an extreme left party and progressive policies all falls. What then does closing opposition bring in this round? Right. I think that what we have to first identify is the way that structurally that Democrats are weaker in state elections, but also just generally, right? I think that the Democratic coalition is not just progressives and conservatives, right? The Democratic coalition is college-educated, wealthy liberals, but also those earning under $50,000. It includes Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, liberals, progressives, youngs, and people located in small geographic clusters around the entire country. This makes them demographically weaker, but it also makes them clustered and isolated, which further hurts them geographically. The problem with geography is that, as mentioned before, the Senate is skewed. If at no point the government points out as to how they will cause any kind of changes in the fundamental structures of state senates, of state governor races, or of the Senate itself, they can't access any of these changes, because the Senate will always mean that the state of Wyoming gets 2 representatives, while the state of California also gets 2 senators. What this then means is that the Republican Party, if the new Trumpist party in Wyoming tries to just go full bore Trumpism in Wyoming, they'll probably win. And what this means is that you'll end up with like the Senate skew in which 50,000 Trumpists in Wyoming now have 2 senators, whereas the huge divide in California is just further splitting not only in the Senate, but further splitting the House caucus, right? All of the structural reasons and the structural implementation of the US political system in particular, and why the first past the post system specifically harms these outcomes is bad, right? Furthermore, what exactly do these political parties bring with them? And why does this federalist system mean that this outcome is actually uniquely bad for liberals aside from polarization, right? Okay, I think that polarization is bad. And I think that actually what is unmentioned by opening opposition is that open government actually knifes itself here. The prime minister says that these broad groups cater to the middle voter, and therefore they become boring and that they can't excite liberals and leftists. But then their DPM comes up and says how the Democrats and Republicans only focus on the fringe. I think they can't then have access to both of these arguments, ultimately meaning they fall. But so while I've explained to you why structurally the Democrats are weaker, why is this a terrible thing for the success of the Democrats, right? I think that when you point out why this is uniquely bad for liberals, when you see that there is a replacement of the Republican Party by rural whites, these political parties will turn on their own wings in these political battles. And this will not just happen at the federal level, this will also happen largely at the state level. I think that when you look at the federal battles that will happen, sure, there'll be these large coalitions where everyone just agrees to kind of go down into the broad categories of like national economy. But when you look at the state level in particular, you start to see very wild outcomes in which you can't simply ignore that the Trump party will exist and just be there. I think that when you look at the state level, you actually see moderation occur where Trumpist candidates do kind of typically lose for governorships. They lose for and they lose for House races against more moderates. In the case, even if that they are showing up to be bad, I think that splitting these races into 4-way systems doesn't solve, because the problem is at the end of the day, it is a first past the post system. This means that a small Trumpist party with just 33% of the vote can win an entire election in a local race or even a federal race because of the way the electoral college system, the way our voting system works. And if no team here can point out as to why they can structurally redraw the United States or any of the institutions that is built up with, they cannot argue using the arguments that would come from a parliamentary system and apply those simply to this. Those who get hurt are those who don't have access to a larger base, and those are minorities. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the government whip speaker, please.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're currently audible.
Awesome. Right, just setting up my timer. I'll start. 3, 2, 1. Debates about the US can always be kind of frustrating because there are so many different contexts that you need to consider, and it just ends up being throwing around facts around on both sides of the house. But I think the crucial thing that people need to understand about how this debate operates is that it exists in lots of different contexts. So on both sides of the house, the extreme Republicans and Trumpist people are likely to win in Wyoming. But on our side of the house, instead of Democrats standing against these Republicans in more swing states, in like these Republican suburbs where you have people who are more willing to switch, instead of that being a Democratic Republican race, it ends up being a new moderate Democrat versus new moderate Republican race, or a moderate Republican versus Democrat race. And on those grounds, you're able to shut out the extremes, and that's why we think closing government is able to win. I'm going to go team by team through the round, starting off with why our material is able to be open in government. Because everything that open in government says is reliant upon, one, why moderates don't win in the existing Republican Party, and two, why the moderates are able to win at the point at which you break off. And I think we provide a lot more mechanization on both these grounds. To be fair to open in government, they do provide one mechanism as to why moderate Republicans are unlikely to win, which is that our Senate races have lots of alt-right people. But I think Sharon provides you with a lot more material here in terms of the structural reasons that exist with the nature of primary elections, where you have to get a specific group of people on the increasingly extreme right-wing media that caters towards these Republican primary voters, and so on. Another thing here that's worth noting here is that this operates down into the local level too. So if closing opposition is correct, and we need to consider the local things in this round too, I would argue that a lot of these local politicians are career orientated, right? They presumably want to advance in the Republican Party. Like very few state governors just want to stay as a state governor. Oftentimes they plan on running in Senate races or gaining increasing power in that particular way. And if it's true, as Sharon tells you, that the Trumpist Party has been able to monopolize control of the Republican elite, they have their members within the key positions like the chairman of the National Committee and these key senators like Lindsey Graham, for instance, then in order to succeed internally within that, you need to be extreme in the first place and do that. So that means that the Republican Party is likely to remain extreme even in these instances. The only response that we get is that the moderates join the Democratic Party instead of joining a new party. But I think there are a few things that I want to say here in response to this from closing opposition. Firstly, I think that if they do join the Democratic Party, they're less able to win because of the tribalism that exists, because Republicans have been conditioned into thinking that the other side is absolutely evil. That's why Biden was barely able to win, despite Trump being a car crash, because so many people had to get over that initial loathing of the other side. But secondly, I think that also brings in opening government's harms in terms of alienating the progressive wing, and insofar as opening government somewhat prove that's a good thing, I think that is quite important, because because the mechanisms that we provide underline that impact coming out of opening government. In terms of the second thing, in terms of what closing opposition says about how we knife out opening, because we say that we want moderate Republicans to win, I just think this is wrong, because this debate exists in a different set of geographic contexts. So obviously the progressive Democrats are more able to win in the super progressive states like California or New York, for instance, but in the less progressive, more marginal states, this is where the moderate parties are able to come in and actually join and actually be able to win. So yeah, I think that those two extensions then on how moderates are able to gain power and on how they're unable to gain power in the Republican Party prove all of opening government's benefits, and so we take it over them. Secondly, on closing opposition, I think a lot of closing opposition seems to be quite symmetric, because if the nature of the US electoral system is that it just has loads of different extremes, and Wyoming has the same amount of power as California, that's a different debate. That's a problem with the nature of the US electoral system, which is probably quite bad. But that exists on both sides of the house. The Republicans will never have any incentive to redraw it, and insofar as these areas are more extreme, they're probably going to vote for Trumpist Republicans on their side of the house too. So it's really unclear as to what the impact is. Secondly, on the stuff they say about the federalism that exists, which is really important, and how you can actually get moderate Republicans within those federal spheres. I think firstly that's unlikely to be true, because the reasons I already gave, which is that these people are career orientated, so they want to succeed internally within the Republican Party. But also, secondly, the fact that the US system is federal, as Sharon explains to you, provides a unique breeding ground for these people to join. Because if it's true that people care about local issues when they're engaging in these areas, then you can get moderate people coming in and saying, oh, we're going to fix up the national park in this area, or we're going to focus on like getting rid of litter, or we're going to build a hospital, or whatever. And you move focus away from these partisan issues. That precisely provides the breeding ground for these moderate parties to succeed in these localities and in these local elections, even if they don't win on the national stage. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from opening. Yeah, go.
So your point that the Republican Party will remain largely intact proves our claim that in presidential elections, it's likely that the Democratic Party will be weakened and the current Republican Party will gain dominance.
No, that's not the claim. The claim is that the way that the US system operates is that you have a different set of people voting for primaries and for the main election as a whole. Because the primary voters, as Sharon explains, are structurally more likely to be extreme and be the most highly voted people to turn out. That's not a representative sample of the entire election, which has a lot more different diverse views. And that's why these extreme people are unlikely to win on a national stage, even if they're able to win the primaries. That was the specific nuance that we provide. All right. In terms of direct responses to opening opposition, I think firstly they try and say, you have existing mechanisms of diversity. I think firstly the compromise between them is increasingly is less likely, like the US being incredibly gridlocked, but also the stuff about factions existing is dependent upon the factions having relatively equal power, but Sharon demonstrates that's not true because, for instance, in the Republican Party, the extremes have a lot more power. Opening opposition a right to identify why moderates are never able to win because opening government don't explain that, but we actually do. The mechanisms OO say is one, they don't have the traditional name associated with them, and two, they lack campaign finance. I think on the first thing, these traditions are actually bad because of the fact of the negative labels associated with them, as Sharon explains. But secondly, on campaign finance, I think we actually do get campaign finance. Like, for instance, the Lincoln Project, which is a bunch of moderate Republicans, got massive degrees of funding from corporate people because they want moderates to win, because they don't particularly like these extremes. They don't want to be associated with them, and they often know them personally. Also, the material in terms of being geographically beneficial, I think, so they only stand in areas where they're actually likely to win. Finally, in terms of taking voters from Democrats, I think firstly, moderate Democrats are unlikely to stand in progressive bastions, so you're probably not going to steal votes from the progressive wing. So New York and California still vote progressive, and that's just like how this debate operates. Basically, we're able to, there are kind of three sets. One is extreme Democrats who we get, second, moderate people who we also win over to our side, and finally, extreme Republicans who we marginalize. I think we're able to prove that this occurs. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and I would like to cross the floor and hear from the opposition whip speaker, please.
Okay. If everyone's ready, I'll begin time in 3, 2, 1. I'll be addressing this final speech through more of a key weighing issues in the way that I see this debate playing out on two major things, right? The first is more of an apolitical view of what the US political system will be better off with, taking the idea that polarization is a bad thing, no matter which side is taking out. The second weighing point then is specifically the norms of the outcomes in which we've all broadly kind of agreed that more liberal outcomes, more progressive outcomes are ideally better. So, why then specifically in the US political system does closing opposition take it above all else? I think the first thing is just broadly how we actually engage with what the US political system is at the moment. Like, closing government sure does try to go into this, and we'll credit them for that. But I think that largely what the opening half misses out on is just a battle over polarization, right? They talk about the political system only existing at a federal level as if there is an American parliament that these political parties can happen on, right? The point in response to closing government isn't that this is a debate about voting systems, but that to view this debate about splitting up parties without talking about the fact that nearly every single election in the United States is a first past the post election means that largely a lot of the adverse outcomes that are mentioned that are never responded to ultimately still stand. The problem with the voting system means that fracturing lowers the bar for a truly extreme party to enter power, right? I think that even though we highly disagree with the kinds of senators that are currently serving in like Tom Tillis in North Carolina, I think it is likely that if you splinter all these parties, the party that gets the plurality of the vote, like a party against the plurality of the vote is far likely to be a more extreme party. The problem is that unless government, which at no point, even though they were given the chance to show as to why this splintering can create a better voting system, means that this fracturing in a state like Michigan could potentially completely drive the country apart. Right. I think that when you look at the US political system from the eyes of closing government, they try to engage with the kind of federal local, but they only talk about this in terms of elite capture. I think there's more to political parties in terms of just elite capture, because there's obviously grassroots movements. There's obviously things that swell from the bottom. And this is woefully underanalyzed in closing government, to the point at which focusing only on the US political system as a theory of elites rather than a theory of like electoral success and grassroots mobilization falls short. The opening government for the US political system largely, again, I think still has their internal knife that takes out their entire polarization point and the political system point. Because at the end of the day, I'm unsure whether to believe the PM that the parties focus on median voters and therefore lose out on their more extreme voters, like the progressives and the leftists, or if they focus on the progressives and the leftists and lose out on the median voters. As for opening opposition, I think that pointing out this polarization as an increase, gets them some credit, but they don't actually impact out to why these actually why there are actual policies that are harmed by this polarization. And I explain why by mechanizing out how exactly there is a rural skew from this kind of extremism that would occur from the right and from the left in this kind of system. As to the specific norms of outcomes, though, which is I think more where the broad base of this debate occurs, right? I think that on opening government, again, they try to push as to how all of their outcomes will lead towards protections for minorities and leftists and less polarization overall. I've already pointed out as to why I think their polarization point falls short. But I think that even if you are able to get better representation, ultimately what you end up having is the party that actually represents better representation, i.e. the Democratic Party, largely gets hurt. And it's something that both government teams have failed to contend with. Specifically in closing opposition, I've explained why the coalition of Democrats is so much weaker than just progressives and liberals. Because it's very clear that the African American Democrats in South Carolina, for example, are vastly different from progressive Democrats in New York. To splinter the party along these lines doesn't mean that suddenly minorities and leftists will get along and start winning tons of elections, but is far more likely that these minority groups, which have no national base and are largely constrained and geographically isolated, instead get marginalized and pushed out of the political sphere. By keeping them within a large tent party, we are able to prevent this. We're able to prevent this and able to keep a more healthy competitive party to the rise of the right? Because if every single team wants to assert here that the increasing popularity of Donald Trump in the Republican Party is true, that means that even if you do splinter off, this new small center-right party is unlikely to be particularly successful, because we don't necessarily take that both the center-left moderate and the center-right moderate parties will both be successful. As for opening opposition, I think that they just try to say why these parties won't be popular. But I took on OG specifically to show why, even in the case that like these parties are robust, I think these outcomes will still harm the right. I think like opening opposition tries to skew themselves out by saying like these parties won't even be popular, so why we don't even have to engage with that. But even taking opening government at their best, in which these parties are wildly popular, I still think that the disproportionate amount of harms falls on minorities and groups that do not have national representation. It woefully undercovers where these impacts of polarization occur and why the political structure of the United States, first past the post voting and like the rural skew of the Senate, as well as a lot of like elected judges in states like Wisconsin, mean that they don't actually kind of get any kinds of policy impacts, those that are coming out of closing opposition. And lastly, for closing government, I think, again, like I've explained, closing government drives into why a moderate right party will be successful and that the Dems can just win progressive states. But I think that this isn't even true. I think that, like, when you look at, like, in a party, like, if you look at a state like North Dakota, which has, like, less than 1 million people, and you see the kinds of battles that occur there versus the kinds of senators that represent the state of California. For instance, Dianne Feinstein is one of the senators from the state of California. I don't think it's entirely clear to me that California will just suddenly just become this extreme leftist progressive state. I think there is a large number of suburban liberals in California that mean that it might just be a moderate left state, which means if we buy this analysis and we look at like the kinds of skews in the geography and the diversity that closing government wants to talk about of the different kinds of scenarios that we look at, I think that we see that the rural skew that I mentioned mentioned helps the Republicans more, whereas the isolated and geographically isolated Democratic big tent coalition that is barely struggling to stay together is uniquely harmed by the system because they're forced to compete in these massive states, whereas the Republicans whereas this new Trumpist party can just capitalize on all these rural states. Closing opposition is the one that uniquely provides you how the structure of the United States fundamentally means that any kind of attempt to split these four parties will ultimately fail. But furthermore, why the ultimate impact of this failure isn't just on polarization and people being mean to each other in the political spectrum, but actually on the policies that are passed and how the groups that lose out the most are those who do not have national representation, the minority groups who benefit from being in a large tent party in which internal battles can happen, but that do not fracture the electoral success that occurs, the electoral fails that occur through a first past the post failure. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and indeed you all for an excellent round. What you're now going to do is you're going to leave this room and I'm going to call you back in approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Judges, if you could take a look over your notes and come up with calls, or we'll get chatting in approximately 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you. The faster you guys leave, the faster you get a call. Thanks.
I thought this is a streamed room, so you guys have to join a breakout or...
Oh yeah, you guys don't have to leave. This is Orcom. Debaters don't have to leave. Serena, are you there?
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Your teammate is gone, right? Is he
Yeah.
gonna come back, or? Because the
he
OA is going to happen here, so it'll be great.
Okay.
Okay,
So
yeah.
I'll just wait here then.
Yeah, and if your teammate can come back, that's great as well. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anakin, are you there?
Yeah, do you mind resending the meeting link just so I can send it to my...
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll send it here. You can send it to your teammate.
Yeah, I think both OG and CG is here. We're just missing everyone on the op bench, so you probably need to like message them. Please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.